Hey y'all, it's Jess. Welcome back to Roots and Refuge Farm. It is a beautiful spring morning here, and today I am going to be putting in the rest of my tomato plants for the 2019 summer garden. I've been getting a lot of questions lately about planting tomatoes. I have shared in the past some of my tips and growing advice for growing tomatoes. I love to grow tomatoes. It's my favorite thing to grow in the garden. And so today I just wanted to do a quick video showing you guys my method for planting tomatoes and just answer some of these questions that I've been getting a lot lately. First things first, let's go ahead and put this little guy in the ground, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about spacing, pruning, and trellising. How you put your tomato plant in the ground, this is pretty universal. I'm going to talk to you here in a minute about the pruning and the trellising, and those things may vary based on your gardening style, where you're gardening. But planting your tomato plant in the ground, no matter if you plan on pruning it down to one stem or just letting it completely bush out and go wild, putting it in the ground is the same. Tomato plants like to be planted deep. If you look here up close with this plant, you'll see these little bumps and nodules on the stem of this plant, as well as these very tiny hair-like fibers. And if you'll notice, these fibers go all the way up the stem of this plant, up here to the top. Tomatoes actually, if you let them grow on their own, if you don't intervene, if you don't trellis them, stake them up, tie them up, they actually grow along the ground, and they are a vining plant. At least indeterminate tomatoes are, like this one and like most of the ones that you're going to be purchasing to plant to grow in your garden. And basically the way they grow is that everywhere that their stem comes in contact with the soil, like whenever this plant grows up and falls over and grows along the ground, they root all the way along the stem. That's what those little fibers are. Those are future roots. So whenever you have a transplant like this, which I started this from seed in my greenhouse a couple of months ago, and I pull it out of the cup, you can see the root system all in here. And this is obviously a healthy transplant. But if I were to just plant it in the ground to here, this is the only root system that it would have, and it would stem off from this, and it would probably do okay. However, the deeper that I plant this, I'm giving it this much more space to create that healthy root system. Healthy roots are going to make for healthy plants. That's the more nutrients they can take in, more water that they can take in. So basically, anytime that you're transplanting a tomato plant, it's best to go ahead and pinch off the bottom leaves. And I like to do this all the way up to the top crown. And I'm gonna dig a really deep hole where I can put this plant in up to here. Now, one trick you can do, and I obviously did not do it this time, if you wanna come out like the day before you're planning on transplanting, or 2 days before, and you want to lay your plant down sideways in the bed, just like that. Tomato plants will always grow up towards the sun. So if I leave that plant laying on its side right here in the bed, you want to make sure it's well watered before you do this, because it can dry out quickly. In a day or two, this stem will be bent upwards. So if you're planting in a bed, maybe like a raised bed, where it might be difficult to dig a hole that's 12 inches deep, if you do that trick, laying them on the side and letting them grow up towards the sun, you can actually lay them in the hole sideways and get that stem under the ground without having to worry about the stem breaking from you bending it, because you basically just give it the time and the situation to bend itself. However, I have no issue digging a hole to the bottom of my raised bed, so I'm just going to go straight down with this guy today. So the soil in my raised beds, the bottom half is very mediocre topsoil. It's honestly pretty heavy and it's not great. However, we don't till these beds. We just add a few inches of compost every year, and we have great success with that. So as you can see here, I've got all this compost on top. I've dug the hole down deep, And basically, even though the soil is not great at the bottom of my bed, I'm gonna put my plant down in there, and then I'm gonna scrape all this compost that's up on the top in over it. So it's gonna be surrounded by compost. Now, my single tomato trick, the one thing that I would say I always do with all of my tomatoes, aside from planting them deeply, is the egg in the hole trick. I don't know the science behind this. I was told years and years ago by an old man that had gardened in this area for 50 years to put an egg in the hole whenever I plant my tomatoes. And I did. I just listened to him. He seemed to know what he was talking about. A few years ago, however, one of my Instagram followers decided to do a little bit of a test. And she planted several tomatoes of all the same variety, same soil, same growing conditions. And half of them she gave the egg, and half of them she didn't. That was the only variable that changed in those plants. And there was a marked difference in the ones that had the egg. Larger plants, more fruit, better production. I don't know. It's one of those things I've always done. I don't change it, because I just imagine, the year that I don't put the egg in the hole will be my first bad tomato year I've ever had. So in the past, I wouldn't crack these. And for the most part, when I would go to pull the tomato plants up, I might find a few pieces of shell because the root system would crack it. However, last year I did have an egg that remained uncracked, and when I went to pull my tomatoes up, it was just a completely traumatic experience. So this year, as I've dropped these eggs in the hole, I've taken my shovel and not just completely smashed them, but put just a little bit of a crack in the shell to make sure that they have a little bit of a head start in breaking down. And again, I've got the leaves all broken off, so this tomato plant is going to go right down in that hole, and I'm going to push the compost in all around it. I'm gonna go ahead and take off that extra leaf, so I've just got this top crown of this plant sticking out. Now, one thing that sometimes will happen when you are planting, and if you're not careful about this, it can cause issues with tomatoes. Sometimes you dig your hole, and like here, as you can see, there's a little bit of a dip here. And what I want to avoid is creating a situation where water is going to be able to pool up around this tomato, because tomato foliage is really susceptible to sickness whenever it gets wet. So basically what I'm going to do when I put this tomato in is I'm going to kind of build the soil up right around it, and I'm actually going to dig out a little bit of a moat around this plant. Not a big deal, just a little bit, to create a bit of a hill so that when it rains, instead of the water pooling up right around my plant, it's going to go off here around the edge. Because basically, if you've created a dip and your tomato's right in the middle, the water will pool up there, and then if it continues to rain, it'll splash that dirty water back up on your leaves. That's just a perfect storm to end up with funguses and leaf spots and all the kinds of things that you don't want with tomatoes. However, if you create this little indention, this little moat, it will make the water flow away from the tomato, so you're not going to have as much splashback, but also it's going to cause that water to soak in 6 inches around the tomato, and it's going to encourage the root system to branch out in order to soak that water up. So again, you're encouraging healthier roots as well as healthy foliage. Tomato plant in the ground, that tall plant, barely any of it sticking out. It'll take a few days for it to really settle in, and then it will start growing. Now at this point, you would normally go ahead and give this plant a little bit of water, being careful to not just splash it all over the leaves since they are so close to the soil at this point. However, I am going to be planting the rest of this row of tomatoes here in just a minute as soon as I'm done with this video, so I'm not going to go ahead and water this plant right now. Now really quick, let's talk about pruning, spacing, and trellising. I live in central Arkansas, zone 7B, and it's hot here. It's very, very humid, and it's very, very hot. I actually had a conversation with a man that lives in Ohio a few weeks ago, and we got on the topic of growing tomatoes, and he said that he grows his tomatoes in big cages, allows them to completely bush out, does no pruning, gives them 4 feet of space all around, and gets bumper crops every year. That would not work here. It's so humid here that the year that I let my tomato plants bush out, I lost them by the end of July. They were all gone to blight because there was not enough airflow to combat the humidity. That's just a reality of living in Arkansas. So I have begun doing my tomatoes this way, and it produces the most for me, and my plants last the longest. I want to encourage you to experiment in your garden. Obviously, if you've clicked on this video, you are the kind of person who wants to find the best way and do it that way. However, while I think this is a great method and it works great for me, if you want to go about doing this, if you want to create cattle panel trellises and you want to space your tomatoes just like mine and prune them just like I do, do it. I hope that it is just as successful for you as it has been for me. But I do encourage you to maybe devote a little part of your garden and try letting a tomato plant bush out. I did that just to see, well, maybe I messed up that one year, let me try this again. I let one go completely last year and I lost it to sickness. So it kind of drove home for me that this is the way that I need to be doing it with my conditions. Don't be afraid to fail if it means learning a lesson. You have to look at your gardening success not just as this year and this year's harvest, but over the course of a lifetime, developing methods that work for you where you live in your conditions, in your soil, and your weather. So you'll notice here I've got all of my tomatoes in. Now these are all slicers. We just finished planting these the day before yesterday. And so our next step is going to be to mulch. Mulching is really important when you're putting your tomatoes in because it helps with that fungus thing that I was talking about and the sickness. Whenever you put mulch around your plants, not only does it help them retain moisture, it also keeps that splashback from happening whenever it rains. Another good tip with tomatoes, and just from the very beginning here, bottom water them. Do not water with like a sprinkler where it's going to cause the water to come down. The more dry that you can keep the foliage of your tomato plants, the better for their overall health. My plants here are spaced about 18 inches apart, give or take a couple of inches. I actually didn't measure it whenever I was putting them in. And 18 inches apart, that's pretty close. But the way that we prune our tomatoes is to allow them to have one main stalk. We use these cattle panels on T-posts to create these trellis walls. And essentially, as these tomato plants grow up, I will do a video later on pruning when I actually have something to show you. They're all too small for me to show you now. But I will continue to cut off the lower branches of these plants as they continue to grow up. And essentially, once they are fully grown and they're grown up this trellis, there will be no branches in the bottom 20 inches at least. I keep that completely free of any extra growth because, like I said, we want to create that airflow to keep these plants as healthy as possible. Now, we allow one main stalk, and I use a tie tape to tie that to this trellis, and I prune off any suckers. And because of the fact that we do keep them so pruned, we are able to grow these tomatoes 18 inches apart. In some square foot gardening methods, they suggest growing them 12 inches apart. For me, giving them that extra 6 inches or so is erring a little bit on the side of caution because, like I said, we do deal with the humidity issue here. So 18 inches apart, pruned down to a single stake, and tied up to these cattle panel trellises. I do have another video talking about growing tomatoes, sharing some of my tips and advice and just some of the research that I've done. I will link that down below and throw a link up here if you'd like to check it out. If you have any questions, you're welcome to put them below. I also want to invite you to please join our Facebook group. It's just a free group that we've created. It's called Friends of Roots and Refuge Farm, and the idea is to create a community of people who love gardening, for a support system to answer questions and to just geek out over things like tomatoes. I do hope that this helps you. Thank you so much for watching. I bless you. Until next time.